Good afternoon, everybody. This is All Things Chess with Cybertown. Got my adventure hat on today, and it's time for some chess adventures. We're winding down our treatment of isolated pawns. We're going to look at one more game of when it's appropriate to transition to a hanging pawn structure. Then we're going to move on to a review and finalize, and then we're going to move on to hanging pawns by themselves. They are so closely connected that you do need to at least mention isolated pawns with hanging pawns in the context of a transition. But I don't want to let one bleed too much into the other. I do want those to be separate treatments by and large. But the game we're going to look at today is pretty much a foundational game. This is, I believe, the first game that you saw the modern main line played against the Tarrasch Defense. That was another modern main line just completely invented and developed by Akiba Rubinstein. And you also see a very foundational positional way of playing against the Tarrasch deployed for the first time. So once again, Akiba Rubinstein, just one of the founders of modern chess. If you don't know enough of your Rubinstein, you're really cheating yourself out of improvement by not looking at his games extensively. But Rubinstein was white here, d4. I know I mentioned this a few times, but just one of my favorite bits of trivia from the olden days. They played knight f3 here instead of c4, allegedly because they were afraid of the Albin counter gambit, which is this. Which is funny to think, because if I knew my opponent would play the Albin counter gambit every time as black, I would play d4 on the first move every time. You get a pawn, and I'm willing to do some suffering for a pawn. And that's really the fashion of the times. But knight f3, that was their way of avoiding a certain opening line. c5. When I first started looking at this game, without doing any database research or work on the position, I sort of thought this was a somewhat inaccurate, old-fashioned way of doing things. It's really not so bad. I mean, black pretty much guarantees that one side or the other is going to have an isolated pawn, and it's a way of guaranteeing that structure. Not a bad choice. I mean, black can just sort of hold serve with a move like c6 or knight f6, something like that. But c5, I like it. He's basically agreeing to play a queen's gambit except at a tempo down. White agrees to do that. So if white were to play, this were to happen, this would be a queen's gambit except at a tempo down. But does that extra tempo matter so much for white? It's hard to say. But it's an interesting position. So Rubinstein played the principled move, which is c4 here, just continuing the program. It's really the move he has to play. e3 would be quite passive. Or if you play bishop e2, this would be a very comfortable Carlsbad structure for black. The pawn structure favors black immensely, because he can get his light square bishop out before he plays e6. But after this, this would be a very favorable Panov-Botvinnik attack for black. White would either have to play c5 to avoid the isolated pawn, which in case black has a very comfortable game with stuff like bishop g4 and maybe a quick e5. Or just agreeing to play a slightly unfavorable isolated queen pawn. So, very comfortable for black. So c4 is the best move here. e6. Not mandatory, but probably the best move. If he takes on d4, this position has been seen a lot. Best move for white here is g3. And this is better for white. He's got a little bit of edge and mobilization. The bishop's going to go to g2, where it's an absolute monster on that diagonal. All of white's pieces have very clear development roles. The bishop on c8, it's a little bit hard to develop that piece without causing problems, because after bishop g2, b7 is going to be a weakness. So this is very favorable for white. So e6 is probably the best move. Take, and now we have the standard Tarrasch defense. So this is, if black wants to play with an isolated pawn, this is one of black's most respected ways to get an isolated pawn. Something I've mentioned in the past couple of videos, it's harder for black to justify accepting an isolated pawn because he starts down a move. And that's why you see so many more examples of an isolated pawn with white than with black, because most of black's openings either don't include an isolated pawn or they avoid an isolated pawn because black is down that move already. It's harder to come up with aggressive plans. But this is one of the exceptions. This is one of the isolated pawns where black is able to get an aggressive position and justify his isolated pawn. This is perfectly theoretically acceptable. Not one of black's more popular defenses nowadays, but it's worth a try. If you like playing with an isolated pawn and you're looking for something against 1d4, give the Tarrasch a try. It's got a lot of theory nowadays, but it's worth the work if you like the positions. So Rubinstein played g3. So one drawback to the Tarrasch is that in these isolated pawns, it's optimal to have that bishop lined up against that isolated pawn from either side of the board. For the Queen's Gambit declines that we've looked at, where black is playing against the isolated pawn, he can't get that set up immediately. He has to sort of shuffle his pieces around. He has to play like bishop e7, bishop f6, g6, bishop g7, and then he's got that set up. Here, white's able to establish this immediately, and that light square bishop in g2 is going to be aimed right at that weakness of d5. Very favorable arrangement for white. If g3 didn't exist here, the Tarrasch defense would be probably black's best defense against the Queen's Gambit declined. But as it is, the bishop absolutely belongs in g2. 6, bishop g2, cx4. So this is another example how modern chess and computers have sort of rescued a lot of older lines. I remember as a kid growing up, when I saw this position in the books, I was told that cx4 was an absolutely dire error. And the rest of this game was given as if black's initial error of cx4 was enough to just make this a clear positional win for white the whole way. That just doesn't hold up when you actually look at the game. When I've actually examined the game and looked at it, and looked at alternatives, black is perfectly viable here. The most popular move isn't that. The most popular move is bishop e7, castle, castle. And here white has three main moves. You can play bishop g5. That's the mega main line. You can take on c5. That's the next most popular line. And then sort of a more recent addition to the main line. You can play b3. All of these have the same thing in common. They're looking to find a good spot for this bishop in c1. So on bishop g5, the bishop's going there. On the other two choices, dxc5 and b3, the bishop's going to be going to b2. And that's where most of the theory is. cx4 is not bad. It's perfectly viable as long as black continues properly. And it avoids a lot of the modern mainline theory that's developing on that. So if you like the Tarrasch, I would say give this move at least a look. Because in my opinion, black is doing perfectly fine. So knight d4, queen b6. So this is the true error. This brings the queen out to a very vulnerable position, and it makes a positional transformation possible. Bishop c5 is completely correct. It's developing with tempo. It's hitting that knight on d4. It's fighting for the key square. So you want that d4 square to be fought for when you have that isolated pawn. And you're getting one step closer to castling. So this is the sort of move you want to make. Knight b3. So just an example, the positional transformation we see in the game is not possible. So white has the bishop pair here, but black has this nice compact central pawn mass gobbling up space. His rook has been able to develop without any moves, which is very efficient on black's part. This is a balanced position. There's going to be plenty of play to come from here. So knight c6 isn't the best. Knight b3. I would say bishop b4 is probably the best move here. But this is, in my opinion, an equal position. Black's going to continue with natural moves like bishop e6, castle, queen d7. This is just a normal position, in my opinion. This is just a normal isolated queen-pawn fight where both sides have good chances. But queen b6 is the move that gives this line its deservedly poor reputation. So as long as black plays bishop c5, in my opinion, it's perfectly fine. Knight c6. So this is the correct time to positionally transfer here. Again, the hallmarks for a correct positional transformation are it's impossible to play c5, either more or less immediately or within the next few moves. If that's the case, if the person with the hanging pawns can advance c5 immediately or soon, that's sort of a mnemonic device that you want to be considering transferring to a hanging pawn position. Just a quick look at the alternative. Knight b3 would be a clear error because it allows the move that you're always looking to play with an isolated pawn, d4. You've got that lust to expand when you have an isolated pawn. just a quick few moves. And then bishop h3. Black's got very clear follow-ups. He's got rook d8. He's got bishop e4 check. You've got a quick h5, h4 to create kingside pressure. Black is more than equal. Black is definitely doing a little bit better here. But knight x c6, this is correct. So queen x c6 is impossible, so we have to take back the pawn. Castle, white has time to do this. Black can't play c5, so white has time to finish mobilization. Bishop e7. Knight a4. This is one of the moves that in the older commentary is sort of lauded as just genius positional play, and there's no other alternative here. It's an instructive move, and it's not bad, but it's, in my opinion, not the clearest best. Queen c2, in my opinion, is just as good, if not a little bit better. Just continues mobilization. Black still can't play d4 or c5, so white has time to continue to mobilize his pieces. When you're choosing between two different moves, if one mobilizes a new piece and the other doesn't, you should definitely think about mobilizing the extra piece, because you're never going to be regretting getting more pieces into the fight. Castle, bishop e3, and then white just continues that mobilization. d4 can't be played. Black has to play something depressing like this, but this is truly depressing position for black. White's going to play a knight a4 to put pressure on there and hop into the c5 square. This is just much better. But if he plays d4, he's just losing that pawn. Okay, and this is completely winning for white. That pawn is dropping off. He can't play c5 because the rook on a8 is hanging. So in my opinion, queen c2 is a little bit better of a move. Knight e4 is logical because it's aiming for that weak c5 square, but white had a better way of doing this. But we continue. Bishop e3, again, purely logical play, aiming for the c5 square. That's the sort of thing you want to do in these positions, is go for that blockade before those pawns can move. Rook c1. Bishop e4. So black's actually playing quite well here. None of the older commentaries thought anything about this position other than white was clearly better here, and this is just a raffle stomp for white. It's really not. I think white's a little bit better, but this is still a tough fight. So white plays f3, and this is a pretty ugly move. You see this sometimes, to sort of take these squares, the e4 and the g4 squares, away from black's fire pieces. But this is really ugly. You want to avoid making pawn weaknesses like this when it's possible. White can very simply just play rook e1. And white's a little bit better here. Let's see. Maybe continue with b3 here. That seems eminently reasonable. Or actually, no. Probably want to play knight c5 immediately, because he was threatening c5 as a positional threat. Knight c5 looks eminently reasonable, and this is a fight. You know, white's a little bit better here, but this is still a very dangerous position for both sides. But f3 just creates that ugly pawn formation on the king side there. The pawns are just a little bit more weak than they were. Plus, this bishop on g2 is very upset. It's going to take at least a few moves to get that bishop back into the game, if not longer than that. So bishop e6, bishop f5 is a little bit more active. Takes the c2 square under possession, so white can't double up on the weak c-pawn. Bishop e6. Bishop c5. Knight c5 is another option. Typically, when you can, you want to keep your bishop pair. Just example, bishop c8 is the best move. I give another line here of what happens when you take the pawn, but bishop c8 is the best. And actually, I think knight c5 is a little bit better, because this is just a slight edge for white, but it's a very stable edge for white, because that c5 blockade isn't going anywhere, and white has time to mobilize. You can play moves like rook f d1, or you can double in the c file, which is probably more efficient, and then try to find a way to get that bishop on g2 back into the game. Something like bishop f2, bishop f1, e4, something like that. But bishop c5, it's not horrible, but you typically don't want to be trading that many pieces off when you're fighting against a weak pawn on c6 like that. It's sort of the same double-edged sword that you face when you face an isolated pawn. You want to trade enough pieces off to stop any sort of kingside attack, but once you have the kingside attack under control, you want to keep enough pieces on the board to actually attack the weaknesses. If you just go straight into a boring ending, you're not going to have enough material left to attack the weaknesses. Bishop c5, rook f8. In my opinion, again, the older commentaries are just they're very story-oriented. They don't really tell an objective tale of the qualities of the position. All the older commentaries mostly just skip over this moment and say that, this is just part of White's coronation path, because he's just completely winning the whole time. Things are just equal here. In my opinion, this is just a balanced position. The pawn on c6 is absolutely weak. But that pawn and that e-file is also a weakness for White's. If Black can double his rooks and play something like bishop f5, that pawn on e2 really isn't terribly happy. The pawn on c6 is weak, but White has to organize to attack that, and that gives Black time to organize his own counterplay. Or Black can even play something like c5 and d4 at that time, and develop aggressive play with the hanging pawns. So, in my opinion, this is just a balanced game. Queen d4. This is correct play for Rubinstein. This is a beautiful move. It nails down basically all the dark squares across the board. Rook e8. This is just too passive. When you're defending, and Black is defending here. He's got the weakness in c6, so he's sort of defending that. Don't defend passively. This is clearly best, because it's doubling the rooks on the e-file. Because White's got his own weakness. Because of that f3 move, he can't really play e3 as strongly. So he's got a weakness on e2 that he has to worry about. Just double the rooks on the e-file and get active. Don't defend passively. Instead, Black's just sort of hunkering down when he doesn't need to. And again, he's hunkering down again. He's putting his rook, instead of on that nice open e-file, it's behind that weak pawn on c6 where it's just not doing anything except defending. Don't hunker down if you don't need to. Get active play. Stay active. e3, activating the light square bishop, that's good. Knight c5, that's correct. Not the most correct, probably rook fc2 is the best. This is sort of the double-edged sword. You do want to keep pieces on the board to help attack, but he trades the knights off instead. Rook c7, again, this is just too passive. Black wants to develop his own counterplay. e6. And queen b4, and this is why he played a5, because he wants to try to liquidate pieces off the board and try to get to an endgame where if c6 is the only weakness he has, he can probably defend it. c3. And in my opinion, this is cosmetically better for White. Things look better for White, and they certainly do look better for White. But I think Black can defend this, because the principle of the two weaknesses says one weakness usually isn't enough. Black is going to bring his king to d6 to help defend that c-pawn. And if the c-pawn is the only weakness on the board, Black can hold that. Because his rooks can stay active enough that they can double on the a-file if he needs to defend his a5 pawn, or they can shift over to the king side while White expands over there. In my opinion, this is cosmetically better for White, but it should still be holdable for Black. But rook c7 just goes way too passive. You don't want to go passive when defending. And b4. So this holds the weakness on c6, holds the a-pawn in place. This is exactly how you want to play this endgame. Then rook a5. That goes after the newly created weakness on a6, because that bishop on f1 is perfectly poised at it. Now White does have two weaknesses. He's got c6 and a6 to go after, and White spends the rest of the game showing those. Rook b8. Black needed to trade off. And on b6, the rook defends both the weaknesses effectively. This truly is a depressing position, but Black might be able to hold it. Again, White's going to have to expand on the king side and try to create another front over there to open things up and create another weakness. If he can manage that, he can create a second weakness and try to stretch Black's defenses apart. But that's not a given here. Right now, Black is defending. But rook b8 is just inaccurate. And that just wins a pawn, and the rest of the game is pretty clear. I'll just go through the rest of the moves because it's quick. But this is just excellent technique from Rubinstein. I love h4, just locks down any kingside counterplay. There's no reason to allow anything random. b5, and then just advance the pawn. Just perfect technique. And then Georg Salwe resigned here. This is completely gone. Just rook c8 on the next move, and things are done. So Really, the key to the position... Maybe I'll put that in a t-shirt. The key to the position was this position. Queen b6 really did allow a favorable transformation for whites. Again, when you're thinking about transforming to a hanging pawns position, check to see if the side with the hanging pawns can play c5 or d4 immediately afterwards, profitably. If they can't, if those pawns are immobile on c6 and d5, or if you're playing against white on c3 and d4, if those pawns are immobile, seriously consider making that transformation, especially if you can get pressure on not just the pawns, but the c5 square quickly. So we saw knight a4 probably wasn't the best move, but in this position, if you're able to see this sort of position after bx c6, this is exactly what you want the sort of position you want after you transform to a hanging pawns position, because both these bishops on e3 and g2 are just perfectly placed to bombard those pawns. If A, they ever move, or B, this bishop prevents those pawns from moving nearly all by itself. I mean, look at this position. Neither of the black pawns can move. It is just completely immobile, and white can just build up on those pawns at leisure. This is a dream position for white. So, when you're thinking of making that transformation, look for a position like that, where black pawns can't move, and you're able to build up with absolutely no counterplay whatsoever. So, model game, the older commentary does overstate how good white's position was, and I think white made some clear positional errors. But a good game to learn from. Next video, we're going to be looking at, basically starting to wind down, looking at review. We're going to look at the main concepts for each side, just sort of as a review for everyone, and then look at a couple of model games to make sure we got all the ideas down right. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.